In the confusion following the assassination, the police arrested a dozen suspects in and around Dealey Plaza. All were later released. 3 of those taken into custody were discovered in the marshalling yards close to the book depository, hiding in a railroad boxcar, which was about to leave the area. No official record exists of who they were or what they were doing, yet their arrest was widely photographed by the press. They have become known as the 3 Tramps.
It was determined in late 1970s and early 1980s that one of the 3 tramps, the taller of the 3, bore a striking resemblance to a man by the name of Charles V. Harrelson, who was convicted of killing a federal judge in San Antonio, Texas. A man who claims to have killed at least 5 people previously, has been tried for some of those, and a man who has all of the right connections.
Charles Harrelson is one of America's most notorious criminals. He's currently serving a life sentence for murder in a maximum security jail.
On November 22nd, 1963, I was with a friend at 12:30 in the afternoon having lunch in a restaurant in Houston, Texas. It wouldn't be the first time I've been accused of being somewhere I wasn't, and I probably won't be the last. But no, I did not kill John Kennedy.
He's connected to organized crime figures, the Dallas Underworld, Santos Tropicali, Carlos Marcello, R.D. Matthews, considered the strong-arm man in Dallas in 1963, and Ruby claimed that he was his best friend. So you have all of these connections, and though they don't say specifically, hey, Charles Harrelson is guilty of participating in the murder of the President Kennedy, but there is significant evidence that would make, I think, any investigator want to look at Mr. Harrelson very, very closely.
That is a photograph of one of 3 so-called tramps who were apprehended and then mysteriously disappeared on the day of the Kennedy assassination. And the fellow was, I'm told, at one time positively identified as myself, which is ludicrous if you look at the man. I was 25 the day Kennedy was assassinated, and I would say that gentleman is probably in his mid to late 30s at the very least. But the facial structures isn't even close.
Mr. Harrelson's photograph was given along with the tall tramp photographs to forensic anthropologists, 2 independent bodies or people. And they came back with a report that there was a 90 to 95% probability that the photograph of the tall tramp arrested in connection with the president's killing and Charles V. Harrelson arrested for the death of a federal judge were one and the same.
Everyone who was involved in that thing has been eliminated. Had I been involved in it, I would have been killed. Had I been approached to be involved in it, I would have laughed. Because it's obviously a case of immolation. You're going to destroy yourself by doing something like that, because the agency involved in carrying out this assassination cannot have someone with first-hand information regarding the assassination. No way. The country would destruct if that came forth.
Also kept under wraps and not investigated was the criminal underworld of strip club owner Jack Ruby, Oswald's executioner. Vital areas of his illicit operations in Dallas, New Orleans, and Cuba went unexplored by the Warren Commission. But Ruby's twilight world held many of the secrets behind the assassination. At Parkland Hospital, minutes after the tragedy, one member of the press corps who knew Jack Ruby well was to have an extraordinary encounter. Reporter Seth Kantor.
Just after I entered, there was a group of nurses and doctors standing around with a lot of concern, and Jack Ruby came up to me. He said something to the effect that, "Isn't this just terrible?" And he looked as if he was extremely distressed. I shook hands with him, and I had known him previously, and Ruby asked me what I thought about his closing his places of business for a day or two out of concern for what had happened. And I told him I thought that was a good idea and to please excuse me, I had to go on. I guess that encounter with Ruby took maybe 25, 30 seconds. It was very clear to me who I had talked to and who I had called by name and who had called me by name and who I had shaken hands with and everything. But when the Warren Commission report came out, they said that probably under the stress of everything that was going on, that I most likely was confused and that I talked to Ruby at the police station several hours later.
Ruby denied he'd been at Parkland, and the Warren Commission believed him rather than Seth Kantor.
I was dismayed when I picked up my copy of the Warren Commission report and discovered what they had decided about my testimony. And among other things, I immediately began to wonder, who else they had talked to, who they chose not to believe, and why.
A pristine bullet, which the commission was to allege had wounded both Kennedy and Connolly, magically appeared on a stretcher at Parkland. Jack Ruby's coincidental appearance inside the hospital was not the only fact the commissioners chose to ignore.
They certainly didn't want to go into the fact that members of the United States underworld were dealing with the CIA in connection with plans to get rid of Castro. Lyndon Johnson was very anxious for the Warren Commission to complete its work, to button things up and get out a report. And they were not anxious at all to open up areas of doubt or areas which needed further investigation. And one of those areas was the Jack Ruby business.
Ruby claimed he acted on impulse when he shot Oswald. His real motives were never explored. The Warren Commission believed everything Jack Ruby chose to tell them, including how he penetrated the basement security of Dallas Police Headquarters in order to kill Oswald.
I don't believe that Ruby entered the basement of the Dallas police station by way of the ramp from Main Street, which is the fiction that came about not long after he was arrested for killing Oswald. The policeman on duty at the top of the ramp was given a lie detector test, and he insisted that Ruby did not pass him at any time, and the lie detector test given by the police department bore that out.
Jack Ruby did not come down that ramp. I'll go to my grave saying he didn't come down that ramp. If anybody could have ever proved to me beyond a reasonable doubt that he came down that ramp, I feel that I was man enough to admit, yes, maybe I made a mistake or was negligent in some area. But no, nobody's ever proved that to me, and I'll go to my grave saying that man did not come down that ramp.
Only 4 minutes before he gunned down Oswald in the basement, Ruby had been at the Western Union office on Main Street, cabling money to one of his strippers. According to the commission account, he then walked down the street and simply slipped down the basement ramp unnoticed by Officer Vaughn, a view denied by researcher Larry Harris.
Well, clearly, Jack Ruby did not enter the basement via the Main Street ramp, as the Warren Commission concluded. And indeed, when Congress reopened the investigation in the late 1970s, they concluded he did not come down the ramp, and they cited 8 witnesses who stated that Ruby did not come down the ramp, and several of these witnesses knew Ruby personally. The Congressional Committee concluded that Ruby most likely used an obscure entrance into the building that was located in the alleyway behind me. From there, he would have proceeded into the lobby to an unlocked door that led directly into the basement. Gone down that stairwell and actually entered into the parking garage area of the basement and proceeded toward the railing, up through the railing and into the spot where he was standing when he lurched forward to shoot Oswald. Clearly, it looked better for the department to say that Vaughn had accidentally let Ruby into the basement while his back was turned, rather than admit that a key area within the garage had been left completely unguarded, permitting Jack Ruby unchallenged access to the spot where he killed Oswald.
Larry's conclusions are supported by the immediate comments of several police officers, recorded by live TV cameras just after the shooting.
And this man came from behind this camera in this corner and just dove out of the crowd.
He came from behind that car, that green car there. He jumped up over the rail.
Patrick Dean was the head of security in the basement and was aware very quickly of the predicament he was in. As Ruby was being subdued, Dean remarked to Ruby, "Jack, goddamn, you've got me in one hell of a fix." So Dean was immediately aware of his predicament and, of course, began immediately maneuvering to put the best possible light on the situation.
There was about 15 to 20 men that had searched this place prior to 30 minutes. In fact, searched it twice, about an hour before and then 30 minutes.
The late Patrick Dean was adamant that the only way Ruby could have gained access to the basement was via the Main Street ramp.
I'm positive that that door leading from the City Hall proper into the basement was locked by the maintenance man in my presence that day on the inside of the basement side. And I also had 2 men stationed at that door. But I am positive that door was locked. Now, that door possibly could have been opened by someone from the other side. However, no one did come through there because, as I say, 2 men were stationed there as guards for that particular door that led from the City Hall proper to the basement.
2 reserve officers who'd been stationed there earlier that morning had been reassigned to point outside the building directing traffic, so that this left an area of vulnerability from the stairwell to the point near the railing where Ruby shot Oswald.
The police blundered with Oswald's murder, but the security of the president had been a Secret Service responsibility. The Dallas police had been powerless to prevent the assassination. They were also powerless in carrying out a proper investigation afterwards. The FBI in Washington had at first given their full cooperation to the Dallas police. Their field agent in Dallas, in charge of the Oswald file prior to the assassination, was James Hosty. He was directed to help the police in their initial interrogation of Oswald. But within hours, these orders were changed.
I was approached by one of the senior agents from the counterintelligence squad and was told that there were now new orders and I was not to talk to Oswald anymore and I was not to cooperate with the police department in any manner concerning Oswald's background. I have since determined that those orders came directly from Assistant Director William Sullivan, who was in charge of the Foreign Counterintelligence Squad. He was also the person who had direct liaison with the National Security Council. The National Security Council is the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense. That's about as high as you can get.
Hosty's Washington superiors knew much more about Oswald than they were willing to divulge. Consequently, his surveillance of Oswald had also been based on incomplete information.
I was not aware of the fact that President Kennedy, through the CIA, was attempting to overthrow Castro, and that Fidel Castro had threatened President Kennedy. Had I known this, I would have immediately been concerned about Lee Oswald because we knew he was pro-Castro. Had I known this, then we could have put a whole different light on the situation.
It was here in Neely Street that Hosty first attempted to contact the Oswalds in March 1963. His visit was routine because of their links with Russia. But they had moved on. Later in the year, Hosty spoke to Marina alone, prompting an angry note from Oswald, hand-delivered to the FBI 3 weeks before the assassination.
The note which I subsequently determined was of Lee Oswald was unsigned. It was quite short. It just said, if you want to talk to me, come talk to me. Don't bother my wife. I don't want you talking to her without my being there. If you don't cease and desist on this, I will take this up with the proper authorities, or words to that effect. I had thought it was somebody else at first and just put it into my file drawer until I had a chance to look into it further. Late on the afternoon of November 24th, the day Oswald was killed, I was told by Supervisor Ken Howe to go to the office of Gordon Shanklin, the agent in charge of the Dallas office. He wanted to see me. I was called in there, and Gordon Shanklin reached down into one of his desk drawers and took out the note and handed it to me and said, "Here, I don't want to ever see this again." He said, "Oswald is dead now. There can't be any trial." Now, this was the reason why it was legal to get rid of this note at this time, since there was no trial, and President Johnson was adamantly opposed to any hearings. The FBI then felt it was all right to dispose of this note. I then tried to tear it up and throw it in the wastebasket. Gordon Shanklin said, "Don't get it out of here. I don't want to ever see it again." So I then took it out, and I was going to burn it, but that would have been a little bit messy, so I thought it would be much easier to flush it down the toilet, and that would get rid of it permanently. It wasn't till a week later that President Johnson gave in to congressional pressure and called the Warren Commission together. Of course, by this time, the FBI and probably the CIA and the Navy Department and the State Department had suppressed a lot of different things, and this was one of probably many of them.
Miami, Florida was the city visited by President Kennedy 4 days before his death in Dallas. It was also the unlikely location for a bizarre meeting 13 days before the assassination, in which details of the plot to kill Kennedy were set out with stunning accuracy. A Miami police informant secretly taped a conversation with a visiting right-wing activist in his seedy downtown apartment. It is broadcast here for the first time.
I don't know, Kennedy's coming here, I think on the 18th or something like that, to make some kind of speech. I think it's the 18th he's supposed to be here to make a speech. I don't ever know what it's about. I didn't bet you about it now, you're going to have up there and give it. There's a man here.
Willie Somerset, a union organizer with extensive right-wing political ties, was the Miami police informant. Joseph Miltier was the wealthy, rabble-rousing racist from Quitman, Georgia. In charge of the surveillance operation was Miami detective Everett Kay.
Well, we had to set up the tape recorder in Somerset's apartment in order to make the recording where he met with this other man, Miltier. In order to do so, it was a very large tape recorder that was made especially for intelligence work, weighing approximately 40 pounds. I carried it to the 3rd floor of his apartment, placed it in a closet, and then ran the microphone around the baseboard in the kitchen, and the microphone was hidden by the chairs where Miltier and Somerset were to have their meeting.
Astoundingly, the conversation came up that this man wanted to know how many people that President Kennedy had that was his look-alike that went with him. And our informant wanted to know why, and he said, well, there was plans to assassinate him. The further conversation on the tape revealed that the assassination was to take place from an office building with a high-powered rifle. There is no particular city mentioned,
or was there any particular person mentioned that was to do the assassination? The tape was made on November the 9th, and John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, was due in Miami on the 18th of November, 1963. So the close proximity of the tape being made and his visit made quite a few changes in the security. They changed the motorcade, and I believe that he was helicoptered, and rather than have a motorcade. Additional men were secured. Everyone was made aware that there may be a problem, so there was a drastic change in the procedures. He wasn't as accessible in this city as he might have been in the past.
Boy, if that Kennedy gets shot, we gotta know where we at. Yeah, but you know, boy, that would be a real shame to do that. There would be some stone unturned there. Oh, no way. Oh, hell no. They'll pick up somebody within an hour of that. And they not get with them. Or listen to them. So let's throw the public off. Yeah, that's right. Well, somebody's gonna have to go to jail to get some.
We thought we did a good job and was very grateful for the fact that it did not happen in Miami. It could have very well happened in Miami, as it did in Dallas. So it touched each of us very, very closely, particularly myself, as hearing the words that they were going to assassinate President Kennedy.
Why the hell you figure the best way would be coming on still with a high card rifle. And they're gonna really try to kill it.
Miltier was interviewed by the FBI and then released. He perished in a mysterious house fire a few years later. The Warren Commission ignored the Miami connection and a further opportunity to determine the truth.
It is important to all of us to find out what really happened to President Kennedy. Because what happened to him could happen to anybody else. If a conspiracy can kill the President of the United States, who among us is safe?
The people who know something, why don't they just bring it out and tell the truth? Why lie about something? Somebody knows that they're lying. I know they're lying. Why?
If they lied to us, how much are they lying to us in other areas? And if they're lying to us, can they do it again and again and again? And if so, this is not a democracy. This is a hierarchy, a government or a people ran by certain powerful individuals who have the ability to dispose of anyone who's not going along the party line, so to speak. Not a whole lot different from what I was taught occurred in the USSR all these many years. The truth is the most important thing.
Chasing demons, LBJ versus the Kennedys.